I'm Brett Rock. I'm your host for the Cyber Showcase. Again, this is not my first one of these, so you think I would have remembered to unmute myself there. I apologize. I do appreciate you jumping on here today with me. I mentioned that in the past, I've had a guest for some of these that may have caught that I was muted. So today, as you can tell, I'm flying solo. I apologize in advance for you getting a little bit more of me than you bargained for. And again, today we're going to talk about building a better risk assessment. And our focus is going to be the IT risk assessment. The plan is to talk about what it is, what it should look like, how to complete one. And then we are going to dive into a demonstration of our TRAC IT risk assessment module. So from here on out, let's hope it's smooth sailing. Let's go to the agenda. There is my contact information. You're certainly welcome to reach out to me if you need any assistance. Introductions agenda, what's coming from SBS. We've got two interesting SBS Institute webinars I'm going to talk just briefly about. We'll talk about what a risk assessment is, what it should and shouldn't be, the components of a good risk assessment, the benefits that it can drive, and then we'll save some time for some Q&A as well. All right, just quickly a little bit about us for anybody who's not familiar with SBS cybersecurity. If you've worked with us in the past, certainly we appreciate that partnership. If you have not worked with us, or if you are struggling to remember who we are, we have been in the industry for 20 years. We actually celebrated the big 2-0 earlier this year, something we're very excited about. And I think what's important there is we are in the information and cybersecurity industry. That's what we do. We're not an accounting firm that said we can do your IT audit work. We're not a managed service provider that said, let us do your network security testing. Not to knock either of those types of companies, but what we believe really benefits us and you as our customers is that intense focus on that side of things. So it is who we are. It's what we do. It's what we eat, breathe, sleep, drink, everything. We do have more than 1,400 organizations using TRAC in over 40 states. So again, we'll be talking more about that a little bit later on. We're endorsed across the country for a variety of things we offer. Recently, we were ranked #1 for cybersecurity consulting on G2. That's a cybersecurity, or I should say, a review website for different services when it comes to technology. All kinds of great educational offerings. And then what I do want to point out is just two things in the bottom right-hand corner there. TRAC itself currently holds a 4.8 rating out of 5 on Gartner's Capterra website. That is, those ratings come from our users. So as you can tell, we're very highly reviewed. And then we do have a team of experts that are constantly working to make sure you get the best service possible. So that's who we are a little bit. And if you ever want to get to know us a little bit better, please feel free to let me know. All right, so I mentioned just briefly, I did want to cover a couple of things that are coming from SBS. We do have 2 webinars coming from our SBS Institute team that I encourage you to take a look at. On June 20th, we're going to be taking a break from kind of our regular topical webinars to bring you a kind of a different type of webinar from that team. They're going to do a cybersecurity information security professionals panel discussion, which is, again, kind of different path than they typically do. The panelists are going to share some top cybersecurity related concerns, lessons learned from 2023, strategic projects that are coming up, questions and answers from the audience. So lots of great things there. I encourage you to take a look at that. And then another one that's been very popular is M365 related. So Frank Hulscher, one of our senior IT auditors, is going to work to help kind of unwrap Microsoft Entra and Intune so that you can get a better feel for what that is and how to secure your users, devices, and applications. He's going to talk about the how-to, the security must-haves, and kind of the general best practices to make sure that your M365 instance is doing as well as possible from a security perspective. And that was, as you can see in the corner there, a member request. We've actually got 2 M365 Institute webinar, SBS Institute webinars coming up. So certainly kind of keep a lookout for that. All right, so let's get into today's topic though. What is a risk assessment? So there's all kinds of risk assessments that are out there, obviously. You're doing a lot of them, I'm sure. Vendor risk assessments, business continuity, IT risk assessments, which is kind of what we're here to focus on today, organization-wide risk assessments. But if we're kind of breaking it down into its base level, a risk assessment is something that we're basically doing all day, every day, right? We're constantly risk assessing things that are happening. So let's just take an example. We it's summertime, schools are starting to let out. My kids have been out for multiple weeks now, so I'm ready for them to go back already. But let's say you're going on a summer vacation, right? We're going to go somewhere. We're going to go to the beach or the mountains or something like that, right? So we got to start thinking now about what are the risks. At least some of us do, maybe the most panicky among us. Your car could break down, right? You could run out of gas. You could have a flat tire. If you go to the beach, you could get a sunburn. Back home, your mail could pile up or someone could break into your house. Those are all risks and threats that you need to consider, or probably do consider, when you start to think about, hey, we're going to leave town, we're going to go on a trip. So, what are the risks behind it? What are the controls though? So let's talk about some of those things. We could get a tune-up before we go on the car. We could make sure to fill up the gas tank and that the tires are good to go. We could wear sunscreen when we're going outside, or have our neighbor get our mail, make sure our house is locked, or get a security system. So we're almost always calculating risk assessments, right? Whether it's in our professional lives where we're doing these, all the different IT risk assessments or vendor risk assessments, or any of the ones that you're meant to be doing. But in reality, and again, some more of us than others, we're doing risk assessments pretty much all day, every day. And if we go outside, maybe it rains, so we should take an umbrella. That's a control to mitigate that threat. So again, at the basis level, we're constantly performing risk assessments. When we translate that to IT, it's pretty simple, right? As most of the people on the call are probably with financial institutions, but regardless of who you're with, you probably have a ton of information spread out across dozens of assets, maybe hundreds of assets. And that's not even taking into consideration how many potentially dozens of vendors that have your information as well. Obviously, we need to know and understand what the threats are that are out there and how we're mitigating them. And it's not to just show somebody that we're doing it, right? It's not just to hopefully not to just do the check the box, hey, we did this, here you go, and then we'll stick it in a desk drawer when you're gone, Mr. or Mrs. Examiner, and we'll move on with our lives. But that does give us the information we need to make critical decisions. And I think that's hopefully more than anything else that you hear today, really what we try to do as a company. We obviously want you to be compliant. We want to help you do that. And as we get into TRAC a little bit later on, hopefully you'll understand that we are taking that extremely seriously. We want you to be compliant, and we know that's important. But taking it a step further, we want to give you information that you can use to be better, to be more proactive, to make better decisions. So as we talk about this stuff, again, it's not to us really a matter of, hey, okay, we did this, here's a spreadsheet or something like that. It's how can we take it a step further, make sure we're compliant, but also get something that we can get a return on investment from as well. Where are our strengths? Where are our weaknesses? Where do we need to deploy our limited resources to make sure that we're getting the most value out of them? Which of our assets are the most critical and at the greatest risk? And I think one thing that's important to think about is we don't always consider that, or at least management, board level, CEO level, they don't always think about IT in those terms, right? Or information security in those terms. Again, I'm not knocking them, but the reality is this is not necessarily stuff that makes money, right? But it is something that's critically important. And if you are a financial institution, think about it this way. Would your institution in a million years ever give a loan to someone without making sure you had all their information and making sure it's accurate? Would you ever just flip a coin or say, hey, okay, we know you, you can go ahead. We'll give you whatever you want. Of course not, right? We're going to make sure we take the time. We're going to go through that whole process. We're going to collect all the documentation. We're going to understand what the risks are. We're going to basically see what the controls are, credit scores and all kinds of, history, employment history and financial statements. We're going to make sure we have all that information so that when we make a decision, it's the best decision possible. And we would encourage you to take that same mindset and apply it to information and cybersecurity as well. And that's why we believe the IT risk assessments can be such a critical component of that process. So let's talk a little bit about what the properties are of a good IT risk assessment. So what makes a good information technology risk assessment? Now, that's where I do want to just stop and make a really key delineation here. There are all kinds of risk assessments that you're doing. Some of them are going to be more what we call qualitative risk assessments, right? They're the ones that are, based off of intuition or experience or anecdotal evidence. They're, multiple choice questions or yes or no questions. It's not really a quantitative data-driven approach, right? There's a place for that. That's like the CAT tool or some sort of organization-wide risk assessment. Those are valuable, and we want to make sure you're still doing those. But what we're more talking about for today's conversation is that IT risk assessment, where we're getting into kind of the real nitty gritty, the actual assets. Where are the threats? Where are the controls? Those sorts of things. So what are the properties of a good IT risk assessment? So they're right here on the screen, but I want to go through them really quickly. The first couple that are pretty simple. You want it to be compliant and you want it to be accurate, right? If you ever run into anybody that says, I don't really care if it's accurate or compliant, obviously there's some red flags there. We want it to be something that meets the compliance standards that are set for our industry. We want it to be something that's accurate. We don't want to have something that we can't trust. So those are two that are pretty clear and easy to understand. But let's look at some of these other ones really quickly. Quantitative. Again, this is a little bit different because when it comes to an IT risk assessment, we are going to be looking for something that's more quantitative. It's data-driven. It's based on formulas and calculations, and it's giving us, as you see when we get into TRAC, numerical values, things that really stand out as these are facts. It's not guesswork. It's not thumbs up, thumbs down, or red, blue, green, or whatever the case may be. All of this is going to be data driven. It's going to be based off of information that we can verify as we get into that kind of quantitative approach to a risk assessment. We want it to be actionable, right? We don't want this to be something that we're just doing and sticking in a desk drawer. We're doing all this work. We may as well get some value out of it. So we want it to be something where you can actually use the information that you're getting out of a risk assessment so that you can say where your weaknesses are and where you need to apply some of those controls and those resources. We want it to be proactive, right? We don't want it to be something where we're identifying threats after they've happened. That doesn't make any sense. That's not going to be helpful to us. So we want to make sure that we're going out there and we're understanding what's going on, and we're being proactive. We're recognizing those threats and accounting for them before they actually happen. It should be timely. So this is a big one, not just a snapshot in time, right? It's easy, not easy. It's never easy. I want to make that clear, but it's easier, I should say, to do it once a year and stick it in a desk drawer and say, okay, we'll update it a year from now. And in the meantime, we're adding assets, we're adding services and solutions and vendors and things like that. We're identifying new threats potentially, but we're not going to update our risk assessment until the year mark comes. Again, you can do that, but that does negate that timeliness, the understanding that this should be more than just a snapshot once in a year. Again, doesn't mean you have to put in any more work necessarily, but it is important that that is something that is kind of a living, breathing document more than anything else. We do recommend that it's asset-based, and I'll talk more about that a little bit later on, but just more granular than department-wide. Like our lending department's thumbs up for risk or something like that. We do try to get more in detail by looking at the individual assets to make sure they're secure. Holistic, that's a big one. We want to consider all of your IT infrastructure, so not just pieces. Strategic, it should be aligned to your company's goals. We want to make sure that's the case. Scalable, right? How does this help us if it's something that we can't use as we continue to grow and add services and solutions and products and things like that? It should be consistent. We want to apply the same methodology across the board, and not just inside of our IT risk assessments, by the way, but consistency is good across all your risk assessments. If you're using the same methodology for your IT risk assessment as you are for BSA or compliance, that's obviously going to provide a level of consistency that can be really helpful as you do grow and mature as an organization. Simple. I added that on here. A complex risk assessment doesn't automatically mean a good one. So yes, you may have a spreadsheet that's got 100 different columns, and you're taking into account all this stuff, and that's great potentially. But is it understandable, right? Is it something that if I take this information, can I give it to somebody and they know what that I'm talking about? Maybe somebody that's not, doesn't know anything about IT and doesn't understand what they're looking at. That's obviously not going to be helpful. So, be simple, be easy, try to figure out a way to make this something that everybody can understand. And then collaborative, right? This is something that I've seen, done many ways. Some people, some institutions, some organizations, it's one person that does the entire IT risk assessment and maybe all the risk assessments. And that's perfectly fine. But this is an opportunity for you to involve input from other team members, somebody that might be more familiar with a product or service that you're offering. You can pull them into it and get their feedback. So again, collaboration can be key when it comes to a risk assessment. So again, lots of different properties that I would encourage you to think about when you're thinking about the risk assessment you're currently doing. Is it proactive? Is it quantitative? Are we, is it actionable? Are we getting value out of it? So think about those things. On the flip side, a quote unquote bad risk assessment would be qualitative, right? So it's based off of anecdotal information, experience, intuition. That can lead to biases and misleading information. Again, there's a place for qualitative risk assessments, but not necessarily when we're talking about the IT risk assessment. It could be perfunctory, which is a funny word, obviously, but it could be check the box. Again, that's not necessarily what we're hoping you're going to do. Because again, I want to make this clear. We understand you're putting a lot of work into your risk assessments. If you do that, you should get some value out of it as well. Inconsistency, obviously applying varied methodologies isn't going to be totally helpful. Vague, making it unclear or impractical. Narrow, we don't want it to just consider individual parts of our infrastructure and not really get the full picture. Untimely, not only doing it once a year potentially, maybe even less. We don't want it to be reactive, as I mentioned. And then again, kind of just, is it too difficult to understand? Is it something that, if we were to pull reports or give reports to somebody, can they actually understand what it is we're talking about? So again, those are kind of the properties that we see in a risk assessment that might not be as valuable as you'd be hoping for. So when it comes to doing a risk assessment, how do you perform it? So here at SBS, we do have a workflow that we follow. I'm going to show you it when we get into the TRAC module here in just a few moments. But what are the components of a good IT risk assessment? So we start with the assets. Now, that's not where everybody starts. We completely understand that. I'm going to give you our reasoning here in a moment, but there are a lot of risk assessments that kind of start threat-based. It's probably the most popular alternative, where we look at the threats and then we consider what's happening from there. We believe for you to get the best risk assessment, and this is kind of in collaboration with advice and information we've got from examiners and auditors and clients and things like that, is to start with the actual assets themselves. So when we talk about an asset, we mean anything that stores, transmits, or processes data of any kind. So if you're a financial institution, that means ATMs, cores, routers, switches, laptops, but also things like peer-to-peer payment systems and mobile banking and remote deposit capture and board portals. Those are all things that store, transmit, or process data. So we believe for you to get the best IT risk assessment, you should be considering all of those things. Now, doesn't mean you're going to do them all at once. Risk assessments can be cumbersome. They can, even in TRAC, it can take a while to get it started and get all your assets up and running. So what I always kind of recommend the old adage, right? How do you eat a whale? One bite at a time. Start with your most critical assets and kind of build from there. But we do consider it to be an asset to be anything that touches data really in any type of way. So why do we start with assets? Well, for one thing, guidance basically points us in that direction. And again, that was information that we've heard from examiners and auditors and governing bodies and things like that. So that's kind of the most basic reason why we start there. But the assets are also where the information is stored, transmitted, or processed, right? So that's kind of a big piece of this. The assets are where the threats, and we're going to talk more about that in a moment, that's what the threats are targeting. So that's why another reason we kind of start there. And then finally, that's where the controls are as well, right? The controls are applied on the asset level. So that's why another reason why we start there. We think a threat-based risk assessment just kind of can get you to the point where there's these threats that are out there that we're thinking about, but it's hard to do that without the broader context, right? If we think a certain threat is really critical, but we don't know what assets it could potentially impact, then we might be getting steered in the wrong direction. So more than anything, we believe the asset is the starting point, because if you go the threat route, it kind of gives you a wide range of potential threats without really a clear focus on where the impact could be felt. So we do start with our assets, and it is in TRAC is an asset-based risk assessment. From there, we move to what we call protection profiles. Now, you might call it something completely different, but really what we're trying to do here is understand how critical each asset is from a risk perspective. So that's important. We're not doing the risk assessment with this protection profile. We want to understand the importance of the asset itself. Our recommendation is to rate each asset in terms of importance in 4 key areas. The first one is confidentiality. So how important is it that the information stored, transmitted, or processed by this particular asset, whatever one you're talking about, how important is it that information remains confidential? The second one would be integrity. How important is it the information stored, transmitted, or processed by the asset remains accurate? Think of it like account information. If I'm talking about a core provider, I wouldn't want my account information mixed up with somebody else's, at least not potentially, right? My account balance. And so again, how important is it the information stored, transmitted, or processed by the asset remains accurate? That's integrity. Availability is how important it is the information remains available to us. So if we have an asset that stores, transmits, or processes data, how valuable is it for that information to be available? If it disappeared tomorrow, how bad would that be for our institution or organization? Excuse me. Now, a lot of places we've seen, a lot of risk assessments stop right here. They talk about confidentiality, integrity, availability. Those are pretty common. We also add volume, which is how much information is stored, transmitted, or processed by the asset. We think the volume is important for a variety of reasons, but one of them is it's a nice tiebreaker, right? If we have two assets where the confidentiality, integrity, availability are all, medium or high or something like that, they're all the exact same. How do we know which of those assets is most critical? Well, one of the things we can look at is the amount of information that's stored, transmitted, or processed, which is, again, that volume rating. So that is something that we include that we do believe helps give us even more information to understand how critical each individual asset is. And again, I cannot stress that enough. When it comes to the protection profile, or whatever you decide to call it or do call it, we're looking for the importance of the asset from a risk perspective, not the risk itself. We are going to get to that. So once we know how critical the asset is, we have to start thinking about the threats, right? What could potentially impact each individual asset? What is out there that might have some sort of impact to our assets and potentially cause us to lose data or information or whatever the case may be? Guidance tells us we need to find any reasonable, foreseeable threat that could cause harm to an asset, right? That means every effort should be made to identify all potential threats, not just threats that we think might happen, but threats that could potentially happen as well. Each threat should have a rating applied as well. And you guys are probably familiar with this, but we look at the impact of the threat to the asset. So how bad would it be if that threat were to occur? Anything from, if this threat happened, everything would be fine, basically, all the way up to it would have a devastating impact to the asset if this threat were to happen. So we want to talk about the impact, but we also need to talk about the probability of the threat to the asset as well. How likely is it this threat would occur if we didn't have any controls in place whatsoever? Both of those are going to be important when it comes to figuring out your inherent risk score, which again, we will talk about more in a moment. Once we know the threats to the assets, we need to start thinking about the controls. How do we mitigate those threats? So now that we've identified them, we need to figure out what we're doing to protect ourselves. That's going to be the list of the safeguards you have in place on the asset to mitigate those identified threats, right? Pretty simple. You're meant to create a quote unquote taxonomy of controls, and there's a variety of different ways you can do that. The FFIECIS booklet, CAT, NIST, there's all kinds of different ways where you can come up with controls that you might want to consider when it comes to an asset. But really what a taxonomy means is thinking about a variety of things. What controls could be used on an asset? And again, not just the controls that we already have. We want to identify those for sure, right? Because we want to make sure we're getting credit for them. But we also need to identify the controls we could conceivably put in place as well. Both of those are going to be important to get the best understanding of your risk, and maybe more importantly, where you might go from there. So controls generally can be technical, administrative, or physical, right? Technical controls would be your firewalls and your, all the different technical things that you've got in place, anti-malware, anti-spyware, all those things that are, from a technical perspective, helping you mitigate risk on an asset. But that's just one of a variety of controls that should be considered. We also want to think about administrative controls, so policies, procedures, things like that. And then obviously physical controls as well. So if we're talking about like an ATM, for instance, we might have some physical controls that can help us protect that particular asset as well. So again, think about controls, not just from the perspective of what technical controls we have, but any administrative or physical ones you do as well. We also want to map controls to an asset. So you're going to see when we get in TRAC, this is a big reason we think the tool is so valuable. We don't just give you a list of 1,000 controls and say, okay, you figure out where to go from here. We do take the time, and you should take the time to say, these are the controls that are specific to this particular asset. But you want to take it a step further and determine the value to that particular asset as well. Not all controls are worth the same, right? If we take a look at like an incident response plan for an asset versus dust filtering, excuse me, that's not to say that dust filtering is not going to be valuable for an asset, from a control perspective. It certainly will be potentially, I guess. It's just not going to be as valuable as some of the other controls that you might have out there. So it's you do want to take it a step further, not just saying, okay, these are the controls we have, but how valuable are those controls as well? So that's kind of the first, the big components, right? We start with the asset listing. We look at the protection profile, how critical the asset is. We talked about the threats that are out there that could potentially occur to an asset to cause damage. And then we talk about the controls we have in place to mitigate those threats. From there, that's how we generate our risk scores. So in TRAC, again, which we'll see in just a moment in action, we take the protection profile, we multiply that by what we call total threat score, or essentially the threats, and that's how we get inherent risk. Now, again, I'm preaching to the choir here, I'm sure, but as we all know, inherent risk means no controls whatsoever. Completely out of the box, how risky is this particular asset, right? So that'd be your inherent risk. From there, we take the inherent risk, we subtract the controls, or basically we take away, we take the inherent risk, we start chipping away at it with the controls we currently have in place so that we can get residual risk, which again is pretty simple, but what is our risk with the controls we currently have in place? So with our current control configuration, how risky is each individual asset? And that's really the meat and potatoes, right? That's what we want to know. Inherent risk is great. We have to start somewhere. But residual risk is really what we need to know at the end of the day. How risky is this particular asset compared to all the other assets I've got based off of the current control configuration we've got? So again, we take that protection profile, we look at we multiply it by the threats. Sorry, I'm losing my cursor here. And then we subtract the controls, and that's how we get residual risk. Now, we take it a step further. You don't necessarily have to. The residual risk, again, is kind of where you need to get to. But if you want to take it a step further, and I'll show you this in TRAC as well, we actually want to get you what we call future risk as well. So in that case, we're going to take inherent risk, no controls whatsoever. We look at the controls we have in place currently. And then we also take into consideration the controls we do plan on implementing in the future. Now, that's going to give us what we call future risk, or with the controls we have in place. Well, that little note there is wrong. Future risk is going to be what is our risk with the controls we currently have in place plus the controls we plan on implementing in the future. And what's nice about that is it gives us an idea of down the road, if we do X, Y, and Z, what does our risk look like at that point? So from a planning, budgeting perspective, or as we're trying to talk to an examiner and saying, okay, we know we're not meeting our goal yet, but based off of doing these couple of things in the future, we are going to get there. That future risk can be really helpful as well. Now, just as a cautionary piece here, I would never say, hey, if you're going to do something 10 years from now, go ahead and add that to your future risk score. Obviously, that's probably not going to be valuable. But if it is something that realistically you plan on adding from a control perspective, that future risk really can help you drive that decision-making process as well. So the three types of risk that we're going to talk about when we get into our risk assessment reporting in TRAC are inherent risk, no controls whatsoever, residual risk based off the current control configuration that we've got, what does our risk look like there, and then what we call future risk, or again, if we do the things we say we're going to do on top of what we're doing now, what will our risk look like at that point? So before we jump into TRAC and start showing you what it looks like, what are the benefits of a good risk assessment? So you're already doing a risk assessment, excuse me, maybe it's a spreadsheet, maybe it's a Word documents, I get that sometimes, maybe it's another tool, and you're getting by, right? That's certainly possible. Demonstrating compliance while it's still difficult to do, generally examiners, if you're doing something, seem to give you the benefit of the doubt. So stepping beyond that, what are the benefits of doing a good risk assessment? Well, to us, all roads lead back to the risk assessment. Now, if you are familiar with our company, SBS Cybersecurity, have probably seen this blueprint before. And I imagine if you're seeing it for the first time, or remember when you saw it the first time, it probably looks like Greek. And I can tell you from experience, I had that same feeling. But it is relatively simple once you get the hang of it. This is what we believe a good information security program should look like. And the important thing to notice is that risk assessment is in the upper left-hand corner. And it says right here, risk assessments create the information security program. We say that because we believe a good risk assessment helps answer all the other questions that you might come up with from an information security perspective, or almost all of them. I don't want to give you too much of a blanket statement there. But let's think about that. Let's say we're going to add a new service or solution, right? Let's say remote deposit capture, just as an example. Where do we start, right? We start with the risk assessment before we even add the asset, right? You shouldn't really do the tail wag the dog thing where we add the asset, the product, the service, the solution, and then, okay, we'll risk assess it 6 months from now. Ideally, you're doing that risk assessment ahead of time. And the reason you're doing that is it helps you answer questions about that particular product or service, right? Things like, what threats do we have to be concerned about? What controls do we already have in place that we might be able to use? What might be applicable based off the stuff we're already doing? What controls are we going to have to add that we're not currently doing? What types of controls do we need to talk about? Or preventive controls, things that are going to prevent risk. Detective, do we need to talk about controls that we might use to determine if there's been some sort of threat or inappropriate access or something? Corrective controls, to fix things after the fact. What controls are we going to need to put in place here? Do we need to add it to our policies and procedures? Do we need to create a policy or procedure around this particular service offering? Who needs access to it? We talk about access control here as part of our blueprint. We know we can help figure out if somebody needs access based off our risk assessment. Do we need a vendor? Is this something we can do in-house? And if not, are we going to bring a vendor in to take a look at it? And as we're picking a vendor, how do we determine which vendor is going to do the best job protecting our information? We do a risk assessment and we figure out what controls they have in place and how they're going to protect our data. Who do we need to train on it? So security awareness training. We can even look at the risk assessment and say, okay, based off of that, what topics do we need to cover with our team? Our customers, do we need to train them? And if so, what do we need to talk to them about? Does it need to be a part of our business continuity program, our incident response program? How are we going to test the controls? How often? Those are all things that start with the IT risk assessment. So that's why we believe this is so critical. Again, not telling you how to do things or anything like that, but we believe that the risk assessment is the foundation of your information security program, and getting it right doesn't necessarily mean putting in any more effort, but it does mean doing this so that it can lead to all these other pieces and all these other questions that we can answer. From a benefit perspective, it's pretty simple. Compliance is the big one, right? We want to be compliant. You want to be compliant. We want to make sure you're compliant. Even if you're in an industry that doesn't require compliance or doesn't have regulations around risk assessments, which frankly, that list is shrinking by the day. It is still obviously got a lot of benefits, but from a compliance perspective, you need to be doing it. And we want to make sure that you're being compliant as you're doing it. We want you to be proactive. If we have a good risk assessment, a good IT risk assessment, it does allow us to better understand what we're doing and what threats we need to be concerned about and who we need to train on stuff and all those different things. We want you to be able to be proactive, and having a good risk assessment can help with that. It helps to answer questions like, where are our greatest risks, right? Where are our weaknesses? Where should we deploy our limited resources? I didn't put the word limited in there, but I've been doing this for almost 9 years now. I've never had anybody tell me, hey, Brent, it's great. We've got a blank checkbook. We can do whatever we want, whenever we want. We all have limited resources. We all have budgets we have to adhere to when it comes to information and cybersecurity. The only way to make sure we're deploying those resources in the best possible way is to have the data to help drive that decision-making process. So that's a big component of this. Is this a product, service, solution that we should even offer? are the threats greater than is the risk greater than the reward? Now, in a lot of cases, the answer will probably be the reward is worth it, but at least we're understanding what the threats are and how we're going to mitigate them to get there. If we do have to pick a vendor, which vendor provides us with the best security? We just talked about that, but every vendor does things differently. We need to know what controls they have in place around our information. What type of training should we provide to our staff, to our customers? Again, we talked a little bit about all of this when we were on that previous screen looking at the blueprint, but the IT risk assessment can be used to drive a lot of great decision-making and answer a lot of the questions that you're coming up with. All right, so before we jump into TRAC, again, this is the last slide before we do that, I do want to talk about some of the common problems that we run into, or that as I'm having conversations with people that are looking at the TRAC tool, some of the problems that they talk about a lot. The first one is lack of time. Everybody that I talk to, and maybe I'm mistaken here, so if you're on the call, don't take this personally. Everybody has multiple hats, right? We're all doing lots of different things. We don't necessarily have the time to focus a lot of energy on the risk assessment. It's something that we're going to do. It's something that we're going to make sure it gets done and that the box gets checked. But we don't necessarily have the time to make sure that we do it as well as we might want to. So the first thing is lack of time. The second big problem is lack of resources. We don't have a tool. We have a spreadsheet because it's free, right? And it's the way it's always been done. This is something that we're going to keep doing it this way because we just don't have a better way of doing it at this point. Lack of expertise is a big one as well. If we're honest with ourselves, and I include myself here as well, we don't know what we don't know. And it is very difficult to make sure in this ever-changing world of information and cybersecurity to make sure that we're capturing all the different things that we need to. What threats are out there? What controls are out there? Those are all things that we need to be aware of. And it's not easy with all the other things, with all the other things drawing our attention, certainly. But sometimes we just don't know what we don't know. And when it comes to spreadsheets, they obviously present a lot of problems as well. And again, I run into people that say they love their spreadsheets. I once upon a time said nobody has ever told me that. I've been corrected since then. But the problems we see here are duplication of effort. We're doing things multiple times in multiple different spreadsheets. Simple errors. You'd be surprised how dramatic a difference just accidentally typing something in wrong can make. Version control. How do we know what version we're on and what everybody's looking at? Are we looking at the same thing? Data security. Spreadsheets can get lost or deleted or accessed inappropriately. Consistency. We have a lot of different spreadsheets. They're all done differently. A lot of different risk assessments. That's a very common thing I run into. Reporting. Generating good reporting out of a spreadsheet can be pretty difficult. Lack of dynamism. Sorry. So again, it's not something that's constantly being updated. It's more of a snapshot in time. No integration. It doesn't integrate with any of our other things that we're doing. Our IT risk assessment should feed into our vendor management. Both of those should feed into our business continuity management to get the best understanding of our risk overall. And if we have a spreadsheet, it's pretty difficult for that to happen. And then it's not easily scalable. And everybody wants to grow. And growth typically means having some sort of tool, adding some tools, adding some resources or services, solutions, vendors. So as we continue to grow, our risk assessments are going to become more and more complex. So how can we help? We do have our TRAC tool. We're going to jump into that here. I do want to point out that our focus with TRAC is pretty simple. We want you to put in less work, but get better results out of it. And I know that sounds simple, but the idea here is how do we take the frustration out of risk management? Because everybody can do risk assessments. I'm very confident everybody on this webinar can and has completed an IT risk assessment. What that probably did was make you want to throw your computer up against a wall or whatever the case may be. Take a handful of Tylenol. Again, this is a frustrating process. It's not simple. It's not easy. It's not it's not something that we grew up saying, hey, I can't wait to do risk assessments someday, right? It's not easy. It's frustrating. What we can do with our tool, and I'm going to show you this, is you put in less work, but you get better results out of that. And the way we do that is we're going to give you a ton of built-in intelligence, great predefined workflows, and easy to create reports so that you're doing less work. If you don't have to come up with threats and controls and protection profiles, and we're doing all of that for you. In fact, we spend about 1,100 hours annually just doing that here in TRAC, making sure the information's updated. You don't have to worry about it. That obviously, with the workflows and the reporting, really does make your life a lot easier. It makes your less work for you. But at the same time, we are giving you quantitative data and easy to read reports so that you're getting those better results as well. So again, our philosophy is how can we make less work for you, but better results as well. So let's jump over to TRAC, and I apologize, it's going to make me log in here because I've been talking too long. But once I do that, I will say that we do have 11 modules of TRAC in total. You can see all of those on the left-hand side of the screen. You are welcome to license individual modules, groups of them, all of them, however you want to do it is completely up to you. All of our modules built to work great on their own. Almost all of them are going to have some level of integration with another module as well. So just kind of keep that in mind. But our focus today is going to be on what we call the IT risk assessment module. Now, the workflow is going to follow almost exactly what we talked about earlier, right? That 4-step process. We're going to start by getting our assets into the tool. So we identify what assets we have. We're going to identify the threats that are out there that could cause harm to a particular asset. We're going to talk about the impact and the probability of those threats occurring. Step number 3, we'll talk about controls, which ones we have in place and which ones we might implement in the future. And then the 4th and final step is running good reports at the click of a button that are easy to read, easy to understand, that demonstrate compliance certainly, but also do help us drive that decision-making process as well. So let's go through this. I want to walk you through a real quick demonstration of what this module looks like and how we can do it. So when you first get into TRAC, if you've never done this before, this screen will be blank. So we do have to start by getting our assets into the tool the first time. 2 ways to do that. We do have a bulk add feature called quick add in the upper right-hand corner. But for the sake of, our conversation today, I'm going to click on the plus icon next to assets. And that's going to bring me to this screen as though we're adding an individual asset at a time. Now, when I say that, I do want to make it clear, we do not consider TRAC to be an asset inventory. So when I say we're going to risk assess an asset, I'm not saying we're going to look at all 158 workstations that we've got individually. We do recommend you group like assets together. But in this case, let's say we're talking about adding a new service or solution. Let's say we're going to add remote consumer capture, just as an example. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll give that a name. Oh, if I can type right. Now, as soon as we pick the asset type here in TRAC, and we have about 180 to 190 assets that you can select from, we do start predefining data right off the bat. So our team of experts, based off of research and guidance and discussions with examiners and auditors and clients, we're going to give you all of our information right out of the gate. There's no jumping through hoops. There's no answering questionnaires. None of that nonsense. You pick an asset type in this case, and we start predefining data for you. That starts in the middle of the screen with what we call a protection profile. That's going to probably sound familiar, right? We talked about it earlier. And we're going to look at the confidentiality, the integrity, the availability, and the volume of the information stored, transmitted, or processed by this asset. So again, confidentiality, how important it is the information remains confidential. Integrity is how important it is the information remains accurate. Availability is how important it is it remains available to us. And then volume is how much information. We predefine all of that based off the asset type you've selected, but we do allow you to customize it as well. And we give you tooltips to help you understand what it might look like if you want to make a change. So we're going to give you all of our information, but as you're going to hear me repeat throughout this, we do allow you to customize TRAC quite a fair amount. So once I'm done here, I'm going to come down and I'm going to save it. So I've got my asset in here. That was the first step, right? Pretty simple. I picked an asset, I reviewed the protection profile, and I saved it. Now it's time to perform the risk assessment itself. So I'm going to come back in here, and I'm going to search for that particular asset. So let's say remote consumer capture. I'm going to click on it. That's going to take me inside the asset and give me 3 steps: details, threats, controls. Details is all the information we've already included. If you ever need to come back in here and tweak any of this, you are welcome to do that. Threats is where the predefinition of information is going to come back into play, because we are going to customize a list of threats for you specific to the asset that you're looking at. Now, that's important because there are other tools out there that like to say they have predefined data, but what they really mean is here's a list of 1,000 threats. You guys figure out where they go. We think that's bonkers. So we've cut that step out. We're only going to show you the threats that could potentially impact this particular asset. Every threat in TRAC will get a definition. So if you ever want to figure out what it is we're talking about, you can hover over it. It will also get an impact and a probability score. So we talked about those earlier as well. Impact is on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being devastating. How bad would it be if this threat were to occur to this asset? Whereas probability is on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being most likely to occur without any controls in place whatsoever. So as we talked about earlier, we're identifying all the threats that could potentially happen to this asset. We're identifying the impact of each individual threat and the probability. And we're doing all of that for you. In fact, the vast majority of our clients never have to touch this screen at all, although you are welcome to customize it. You can add threats, you can change impacts and probabilities, that's up to you. The next step, once we've identified the threats that are out there, is the controls. This is where, now that we know what threats are there, we need to identify which controls we have in place to mitigate those threats and potentially which controls we might implement down the road. In the controls screen, it's very similar to the threats. We are going to narrow down the scope of controls to just the ones that could conceivably be included on this particular asset. It doesn't make any sense for us to give you controls that aren't applicable to this particular asset, so we've narrowed that scope for you. Every control in the IT risk module will get a definition and standards mapping. So not only are we going to tell you what the control is, but we'll also tell you where it comes from. And then if you see at the bottom there, we'll also tell you the class of the control as well. So we do have administrative, physical, and technical controls here in the tool. You'll also see on the right-hand side, we have what we call risk mitigation. I talked about this earlier, but not only do we need to know what the controls are, but we need to recognize that not all controls are equal when it comes to each individual asset. So up at the top of the screen, in this case, you'll see an incident response program. That's a pretty valuable control, excuse me, that I could have in place for this particular asset. If I scroll all the way down to the bottom, you'll see an asset inventory. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't have an asset inventory or that it won't mitigate risk, because it will. It's just not going to be quite as valuable as some of the other things on the list here. So again, not only do we need to help you recognize which controls you could have in place, but we need to tell you, and we have told you, how valuable each of them would be as well. In TRAC, where your work will come into play is in the middle of the screen here with these two columns, implemented and plan change. Implemented is straightforward. Yes or no, do you have this control in place right now for this particular asset? So if I came in here and said, hey, we have an incident response program and our remote consumer capture is a part of it, I can click the toggle under implemented, it goes from off to on, and now TRAC knows, yes, that control is in place. So again, implemented is yes or no, do you have the control in place right now on this particular asset? Plan change is a little different. For one thing, it's optional. You don't have to use this if you don't want to, but if you do use our plan change column, what you're saying is we don't have this control yet, but we will be implementing it in the future. So when we look at our reports, again, I'll be able to give you inherent risk for every asset, no controls whatsoever, residual risk based off the implemented column, or where are we right now, but I'll also be able to give you that future risk score as well, which would be implemented plus planned, or what will our risk look like down the road if we do the things we say we're going to do on top of what we're doing right now. So again, just to recap, implemented is yes or no, are we doing it now? Plan change is no, but we will do it down the road. So now we've completed the first 3 steps, right? And hopefully you saw how easy that was. We added the asset. It automatically generated a protection profile for us, so we know how critical the asset is. We identified the threats for you to each asset, the impact and the probability of those threats occurring. We gave you a list of controls that you could conceivably have in place on the asset. We weighted them by how effective they are, and you're going to come in here and tell us what you have in place, what's implemented, and potentially what you'll add down the road, and that's that plan change column. So now it's a matter of running reports, right? If I'm using a spreadsheet, that probably means I have to figure out how to pull charts and graphs and all that good stuff. In TRAC, it's a click of a button. If I go to our reports tab, I will point out that you can pull reports based off of individual assets, groups of them, all of them. You can pull by label or tag or filter or owner. There's all kinds of different ways you can pull reports here. We have PDF and Excel reports. Given the time we have today, we're going to just kind of scratch the surface of the reports we have here. but you've got all kinds of different reports you have access to. And we've also given you packets of reports as well, kind of best practices. So we give you a risk mitigation packet, a full report packet, a GLBA risk assessment report. TRAC actually does your IT and your GLBA risk assessment at the exact same time. We've got a board packet, and then you do have the ability to create your own report packets here in TRAC as well once you get used to the tool. So if I pull up the reports, just to kind of walk you through them really quickly, this is our cover page. If you use it, it will populate with your institution or organization's name, location, the date. We also can get your logo on here so it's nice and pretty. But if I scroll down, this is what we call the asset risk report, or as you more commonly know it, the IT risk assessment. On the left-hand side of the screen, we're going to give you the asset. So whatever asset you're talking about. We give you a column for owner. We do allow you to assign ownership to assets. So again, as we talked about collaboration and pulling other people into the process, you're absolutely welcome to do that here in TRAC. We actually don't charge a per user fee, so you can have as many as you want. It's up to you. We're going to look at the protection profile. So we talked about that. C, I, A, and V, confidentiality, integrity, availability, and volume. How critical the asset is. And we're going to multiply that by what we call the total threat score. Now, if you ever want to nerd out about TRAC, just let me know. I'm happy to do that with you. But suffice to say, this comes from the threat screen. We multiply those two together, right? We talked about that earlier. Protection profile times total threat score. And that's how we give you a quantitative asset-based risk assessment, right? So this is not the qualitative thumbs up, thumbs down, high, medium, low, red, blue, green approach to risk. These are all numerical values that you can use to better understand where you are for each individual asset. So inherent risk, no controls whatsoever. We start chipping away at that with the controls we have in place so that we can give you residual risk. And then we also give you a percent mitigated number as well. We're actually also let you set risk mitigation goals here in TRAC, and we have recommendations for you if you need them. Now, from a compliance perspective, this is demonstrating compliance, right? Or at least that's been our experience throughout countless thousands of examinations and audits TRAC has been through. Here's the asset. Here's our inherent and residual risk scores. Pretty simple. In fact, I'm doing some case studies on TRAC, and I was talking to a client the other day. They said we had a new examiner come in. They had never seen the tool before, had never been to the bank before. We sat him down, walked him through TRAC, showed him the reports, and the guy's quote was, it's the best thing since sliced bread. Now, no examiner is going to recommend or endorse anyway a tool for this sort of thing, but we're very confident that this will demonstrate compliance, and we've had a number of clients come to us at the behest of an examiner. So from a compliance perspective, we're nailing that. The percent mitigated in the risk mitigation goal is where we start to talk about the value, right? Where are our strengths? Where are our weaknesses? And I'm going to show you a report at the end here that spells this out even more clearly. But I can start looking at this and saying, okay, my ATM's at 52% risk mitigated. Well, my goal is 60%. So maybe that's an area I want to work on. Again, the goal with TRAC is to make you as compliant as possible. And in fact, we would argue more compliant because we're doing all of the work for you and we're updating it as often as necessary. It doesn't help if we do a fast risk assessment, but it's not accurate. So we're going to make sure it's accurate. We're going to help you demonstrate compliance. We're going to take the frustration away from doing it. And we're going to give you documentation and reporting that you can use to drive better decision making. That's what we're trying to do. We also have all kinds of graphs and charts and other things that you can look at. So for those that are more visually inclined, we've got some of those. But I do want to point out this report really quickly. This is our risk mitigation report. It puts your current and future risk mitigation status right next to one another. So again, we will give you a future risk score as well. But these three columns are what I like so much. Risk mitigated, risk mitigation goal, risk mitigation needed. Because what those tell me, anybody I show it to is, this is where we are. This is how much risk we're currently mitigating. This is our goal. It's what we agreed upon. It's where we want to get to. And if we want to get there, this is where we need to put our resources. So now it's black and white. It's not, I heard about this at a conference, or somebody told me we should do this, or I read about this in a blog. This is your hard data telling you exactly where you need to put your resources, your limited resources, to make sure you're getting the most value out of them going forward. So if I have $1 left to spend, where should I spend it to get the most bang for my buck? That's what we're trying to do. So that is the IT risk assessment module very quickly. Again, 4 steps. Get your information in here, all your assets in here, using a ton of predefined options to select from. We identify the threats for you. Let me back up. We give you a protection profile for every single one of them. We are going to help you identify all the threats that are out there, the impact and the probability of those threats occurring. We're going to give you a list of controls that are weighted by importance for the particular asset that you could conceivably have in place. You tell us what you've got, maybe what you'll add down the road. And then we run reports at the click of a button that demonstrate compliance, but also help us drive better decision making. Pretty simple, or at least as simple as we can make it. So just bouncing back to wrap things up, or as we start to wrap things up, the benefits of TRAC, we talk about accelerated risk management. Anecdotally, in our conversation with our customers, we understand that it's about 5 times faster than doing the risk assessment on a spreadsheet. That's generally what we're hearing. So a much easier, faster way to do the risk assessment, but we're also not sacrificing any of the quality, right? Any of the accuracy. We're doing that for you as well. It eliminates duplication of efforts because we're all on one page. It provides budget-friendly expertise, right? We're basically giving you a virtual security expert when you sign up for TRAC because we're doing all of that information. We're getting all of that information for you, so you don't have to worry about doing it. We help you optimize your spending. Every dollar has to be accounted for. Every dollar has to go to the right spot. TRAC can help make sure that's the case. We help remove obstacles to growth. Growth generally means adding technology and services and solutions and vendors and things like that. This is a tool that can help make sure that we're doing that safely and securely, and that we're preventing losses as well. We're not going to have to worry about fines and if you use it correctly, the goal is to help prevent losses from fines and breaches and all those different things that can really, obviously hurt the organization. All right, so just quickly takeaways, and then I'm going to see if any questions came in. Whether or not we like it, we do have to do IT risk assessments. And if we're going to do it, we may as well do it in the best possible way. A good IT risk assessment can demonstrate compliance, certainly, but also helps with that critical decision-making process. All roads lead back to the risk assessment. It's the most important thing we can do from an information security perspective in our mind, and it can help you answer all kinds of questions if you do it well. And again, doing it well doesn't necessarily mean putting any more effort in. And then certainly TRAC can help as well. I also want to point out, I do have a slide deck and I can send recordings of this webinar. So if you want to reach out to me and get those, you're welcome to. We also have a web page obviously dedicated to TRAC that you're welcome to look at. And then I included a blog post there as well. So I'll have my contact information up here. Feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy to answer any questions and certainly provide the slide deck and things like that as well. So if you're jumping off, I really appreciate you taking the time today. I'm going to pop over here and see if any questions came in. I don't think I see any yet, so I'll stick around for a few minutes. I do see a lot of discussion about me not realizing I was muted at the start, and I did not. So again, I apologize there. But I appreciate your time today. I hope this was helpful. We'd love to see you on TRAC in the near future if you're interested. And again, please feel free to reach out if there's anything I can do to help. So thank you so much, and have a great day.